Great, well, very warm welcome through. This might have been the first time you've been in the theatre here. It's quite a building, isn't it? We've got Sadharaja coming. Great. Yeah, so my name's Arthasiddhi, and I am just going to be introducing what we're going to be doing in this second half. But a particularly warm welcome to you guys who've come through from the course. Very good to have you here with us, and we've got an exciting evening for you. So what we've been doing in this series is exploring how Buddhism radically changes society. Now that might be a surprising statement. We generally think of Buddhism as kind of working on your own mind, meditation, quite private in a way, but we've been drawing on the life and work of a Buddhist called Ambedkar, an Indian Buddhist who died back in 1956, having officiated over a mass conversion of Buddhists, and he effected a radical change in society. It's quite a story, very, very inspiring story. But the reason why it's... you okay there? Do come down, we'll find you a... Would you like a chair or a cushion? Chair, great. Great. Marvellous. Yeah, so the reason why he is a figure that we're particularly exploring is that he strongly influenced Sangha, who founded this movement. So Sangha said it was through his contact with Ambedkar that he began to see more fully the altruistic dimension. He began to understand more fully the altruistic dimension of the Buddhist life. So that's how he's come to actually influence many of us who've been ordained and who are involved in True right now. Now his work was entirely in India. So it's a bit of a sort of imaginative leap for us. Very, very different society. Very, very stratified society, stratified through the caste system, which Ambedkar was born into the bottom of, and he worked politically to make the caste system illegal. It's now become illegal. But what he discovered was that wasn't enough. He discovered that to change society, to change people's lives, politics, law wasn't enough. And so he turned to Buddhism to do that. Quite an extraordinary figure, quite an extraordinary story, very, very inspiring story. And we're going to hear now from Stephen, and then afterwards I'm going to be interviewing Padmasuri, who herself lived and worked in India. But I've asked Stephen because this touches on a theme that runs a long way back in his life, the theme of altruism, the theme of how to affect society positively. And he was relatively unfamiliar with Ambedkar, but largely through this series, or it's been increased through this series, his interest in Ambedkar. So the question is, what does Ambedkar's message look like for us? What are the implications for us? Stephen has grown up in a very, very different society from the one that Ambedkar lived and worked in. So that, as well as actually, he's he's a lovely communicator actually, Stephen's lovely, clear mind, but very, very sort of easy, natural delivery. I don't want to set you up too much. No. But,
not at all.
So that was the other reason why I invited him. So I think that's enough of an introduction, so I'll hand over to you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks, Arthasiddhi, and good evening, everybody, and very warm welcome, particularly to people who've come from the introduction course. It's really great to have you here with us tonight. And also a very warm welcome to all our friends on Zoom. I hope you can hear me okay. Anybody, any signals? Oh, thumbs up, that's great. Okay, thanks, Lisa. Always need to check that, just to be sure. So the title of this evening is The Dharma Revolution in Practice. It's an amazing title, isn't it? And I must admit, when I read it on the website, Arthasiddhi didn't mention it when he asked me to give the talk. It did send a bit of a shiver down my spine. But I hope I'll try and respond to it. So it's a challenging title, and what does it really mean? Well, I think revolution for most of us, particularly in the West, is a term with very strong political connotations. But when you think about it, revolution simply means turning or turning around. And for us as Buddhists, it's a deeply dharmic term. So the Dharma Revolution we're particularly referring to in this series is the one that was started by Dr Ambedkar on the 14th of October 1956 at the Diksha Bhumi at Nagpur, with a mass conversion of hundreds and thousands of his Dalit followers to Buddhism. And at that ceremony he took 22 vows, and if you get the chance to read them, they're well worth reading. They're a very impressive set of vows to take. But then I also thought back to the Buddha's first sermon after his enlightenment in the deer park near Benares, the Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta, in which it said that the Buddha started turning the wheel of the Dharma. And it's still turning 2,500 years later, and hopefully turning here tonight. So the Buddha in his teaching, he rejected the caste system. Must have been a very radical thing when you think about it in his day. He wanted and he believed that his Dharma was available to all people without any discrimination or any division, regardless of class, caste, gender. Everybody could turn to the Dharma and be liberated through it. So, the Buddha's revolution, if you like, is a revolution of the mind. And I think this was one of the things that really inspired Ambedkar. And I think the other thing that he mentions a lot is the fact that he sees Buddhism as being absolutely centered on morality. And I think those two things, the revolution of the mind and Buddhism as morality, were two of the things that really convinced Ambedkar that Buddhism was the best religion and the raft that would carry his people to the shore of liberation. So what does the Dharma Revolution mean for us and for me here in the 21st century in the West? Well, as Arthasiddhi said, I've been aware of Ambedkar for quite a long time, but from quite sort of a distant awareness. And this course has been fantastic in bringing him much more to life. Particularly last Sunday, we had Dharma Revolution Day, led by one of our Indian order members, Sangha here. And it's just a really fantastic event, and it really brought him and his life much more to life for me. So I've been trying to reflect, I think, on what I see as the kind of key qualities that Ambedkar embodied that are relevant to everybody. And it was very moving. We had a talk last week actually from two of the Indian order members who live here in Cambridge, Sangha himself and also Sujata, a woman member of the Sangha. And they talked from a very personal perspective on how Dr Ambedkar had profoundly changed their lives. In fact, I remember Sujata said that without Ambedkar, she simply wouldn't be here talking to us. So we have, that to thank him for, if nothing else. So, as Arthasiddhi said, I and probably most of us come from a very different background to Dr Ambedkar, who was born into the Dalit caste, what were known as the untouchables in India. So I come from, I guess, one of the most privileged groups in society, white, middle class, European, living in a comfortable city like Cambridge. So you might say, well, so how is Ambedkar relevant to me and to all of us? Well, I think, truly great lives in a way transcend their sort of time and context. So, obviously Ambedkar's whole life was deeply steeped in the fact that he was an Indian who was born into the Dalit caste. But, the relevance of his life, I think, transcends that. So I've tried to sort of identify what I see as the key aspects that are genuinely inspirational in his life. And I came up with three qualities, really: wisdom, compassion, and courage. So wisdom, if you know anything about Dr Ambedkar, he was a highly intelligent and a very determined man who, despite all the obstacles, achieved extraordinary academic success. I think he became one of the most highly qualified people in India in his day, and he also achieved quite high professional qualifications in law. But I think, more importantly and beyond this, he had the quality of insight, the ability to kind of look deeply into situations and questions such as the caste system, and to see the underlying causes, ideas that created those systems. So he came to the realization that the caste system was fundamentally based on an idea, a kind of human mental construct, and that then became systemized, and then those systems then became seen as somehow inevitable aspects of society, and to some people even to have a kind of divine ordinance. But he also saw that what is created by the mind can be overcome by the mind. That takes us back to the Buddha's insight, and that true emancipation starts with the emancipation of the mind. And as Arthasiddhi said, he saw the limitations of political action and turned to religion as a way to effect that change that he saw as being necessary. He identified Buddhism, having done a very thorough, in typical Ambedkar style, a very thorough exploration of all possible religions. He arrived at Buddhism and he said, this was the right religion. He said, I like the religion that teaches liberty, equality, and eternity, and fraternity, that as well possibly, and these are the teachings of my master, the Buddha. So the second quality I think his life exemplifies is compassion. So com meaning with, and passion from the Latin suffering. So being with suffering, being with the suffering of others. With his academic qualifications and professional qualifications, he could have had a very successful life, either in India or probably anywhere in the world. But somehow this never really seems to have been an option for him. And for him, his entire life's work was dedicated to overcoming the oppression and cruelty of the caste system, and especially the treatment of the Dalits. And I think his life exemplifies a kind of selflessness based on the recognition of the deep interconnectedness between all beings. And the third quality that I've identified is courage. So I think all through his life, Dr Ambedkar faced great personal challenges and hardships and dangers. I mean, as a very young child, he experienced the injustice and cruelty of the caste system in a very direct way. And then later, as a student in the USA and then in the UK, he experienced racist attitudes. There's a very nice biographical film about him. Not a great film, but it's a very good film in a way. It gives a good portrayal of his life. And there's one scene I really like where he's studying in America and he makes friends with a black American. They're working together in a restaurant, I think. And the American guy invites him to his church, one of the black American churches. So there he is, and somebody must have told the pastor about the caste system. So the pastor is telling the caste of black Americans about the caste system in India. They can't believe it. They can't believe there can be such a cruel system. And at the end of it, the pastor says, we wish our brother, Dr Ambedkar, all success in his work in India. So I think that, despite all these challenges that he faced, and of course when he returned to India and was working to overturn the caste system, that stirred up huge amounts of opposition, particularly from the higher caste, as you can imagine. And he said at one time he felt he must be the most hated man in India. But despite all this, he never seems to have wavered from his path, and I think he must have possessed an extraordinary level of inner confidence and conviction. And I think, in a way, these three qualities together bring to mind the Bodhisattva figures in Buddhism. And for me also, the archetypal Buddha Amoghasiddhi, the Green Buddha of the North, who exemplifies fearlessness and compassionate action. And I think is an inspiration to anybody who wants to respond directly to suffering in the world. And I remember on Sunday, Sangha said that he regards, and many of the Indian Buddhists regard Ambedkar as a living Bodhisattva, or a very recently living Bodhisattva, a contemporary Bodhisattva. So why specifically does Ambedkar inspire me? Well, I suppose I need to say a little bit about my own history and my own sort of spiritual journey in a way. So my earliest engagement with religion and spiritual life was really, in my teenage years, was really centred around questions such as, why is there so much suffering in the world, and why is there so much inequality, and how do we find meaning in life? And I remember having a very strong sense that, for me at least, any religious life needed to find expression in and engagement with the outside world. And I think these concerns in my teens and 20s led me to get involved in many of the kind of social, political causes of the time, sort of anti-racism movements, CND, supporting the miners' strike, anti-apartheid. You can probably guess my age from all this. Raising money for famine relief in East Africa, and so on. And then later in the 20s, I joined the Quakers, and I was particularly attracted by their values of a kind of open, non-dogmatic spirituality and an active engagement in social issues and questions and actions. So, Quakers have, I think, a very proud history of being at the forefront of the anti-slavery movement, good employment and housing, women's suffrage, prison reform, and so on. And I remained a Quaker for about 20 years. So around that same time, once I qualified as an architect, I'm a practicing architect, I had a very strong wish, sort of aspiration to work overseas, in overseas development. I've been inspired by some tutors I'd had at college. I applied to VSO, voluntary service overseas, and I went to Bhutan, worked there for 2 years. And I think this was probably when I first heard about Ambedkar. Didn't know much about him, but heard the name. And that was also my first encounter, my first direct encounter with Buddhism, which left a very deep impression on me. I think, my motives at that time were very complex. I guess all our motives are pretty complex most of the time. Partly it was, simply a taste for adventure. It's always been a strong theme for me. But there was also, I think, a strong wish to be useful, to provide some level of service to others. And also a desire to understand the lives of people whose lives were very different from my own. We came back from Bhutan, and then a few years later went to Uganda and worked in Uganda for 5 years, again in development. So I worked on projects in the fields of education, prison reform, trying to introduce a restorative justice system in place of a punitive one. And also cultural development. Did a very big project with one of the leading music, dance and drama groups in Uganda, and also creating a centre for the sort of propagation of development theatre and the traditional performance arts, music, dance and drama. And a key aim of this was to encourage a more positive presentation of indigenous culture as something of beauty and value. So we came back to the UK about 20 years ago, and I became a Buddhist 18 years ago. I was really inspired by the clarity and directness of the Dharma. For example, when I read the Buddha saying, "I teach about suffering and the ending of suffering," that really went straight to my heart. And I know this can sometimes be seen as a very personal, individual matter, and I think the Buddha is very clear about the question of individual responsibility. But the Dharma also teaches that all beings are deeply connected, and that true liberation has to mean the liberation of all. And most of the Prajnaparamita sutras, the Mahayana sutras, teach this about the illusory nature of our rather fixed idea of self and the separateness of beings. And for instance, in the Diamond Sutra, the Buddha says, "We must lead all beings to the shore of awakening, but after these beings have been liberated, we do not, in truth, think a single being has been liberated." Slightly mysterious language, but I think it expresses it very beautifully. So since returning to the UK just over 20 years ago, I've maintained a very strong connection with Uganda. Somebody said it's a bit like a virus. Once you've got it, you can never really shake it off. You keep getting drawn back, and I certainly have been. I love the country very deeply. I've got very, very close, good friends there. And I've been involved in various projects, usually on a sort of pro bono basis, But I think it's really important to emphasise that there's no element for me of self-sacrifice about this, because it's been enormously enriching in my life. I think I've gained way more than I've given. And it's also been a bit of a creative outlet. It's given me access to the kinds of projects and people and situations that I simply probably wouldn't have encountered otherwise. And in the last almost decade now, actually, I've become involved with the first Buddhist centre in Uganda, founded by Bhante Buddha Akita, who's the first black African ordained Theravadan bhikkhu. And he's become a close personal friend of mine. We spoke 2 nights ago. It's just been a real privilege, actually, and absolutely fascinating to be involved with the very early stages of the growth of Buddhism in this African context. So, coming right up to date, really, I suppose, I've become, in recent years, like so many others, increasingly alarmed at what I see as the headlong descent towards climate and ecological breakdown, and the huge amounts of suffering to all beings that will entail. And I'm constantly challenged by the question, how should we respond to this? And I think that in recent weeks I've come increasingly to see that Dr Ambedkar, I think, could be a real inspiration in this. If you think of those 3 qualities. So wisdom, I think we need wisdom to enable us to look deeply into the underlying causes of the social and economic systems that have led to the destruction, and so much destruction, of our fragile world. We need compassion, I think, to allow us to realise that the only real solutions are common solutions that take every living being fully into account. And we also need courage to confront our own tendency towards blame or division, but also towards despair and inaction. You can very easily, I find myself often drawn towards despair, and I have to work against that. So we need to be resilient in the face of all this in order to keep going and keep doing what we can. So I think we also need a revolution of consciousness, and again on Sunday at the Dharma Revolution Day, Vajratara gave a wonderful talk, and she talked about this a bit, and she said that she thought that we needed a revolution of consciousness that can imagine a better society. In a way, something almost akin to a pure land, a land that's based on positive values, maybe based on Ambedkar's vision of liberty, equality and fraternity, at the very least. And in a sense, the changes that we need to make in society to avoid the worst catastrophe, I believe, are at the same time the same changes that we need to create the better society, and one that will allow all beings to flourish and have the potential to achieve liberation. So we could really do with a Dr Ambedkar right now, I think. But short of this, I think we can all look to his example to inspire and encourage us to work for these positive changes. And I think this will enable the Dharma Revolution to keep turning. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very, very much, Stephen. A whistle-stop tour, but I think you really shared something very, very profound, clear, and far-reaching with this. So thank you very, very much, and very contemporary, very relevant. Yeah, so thanks very, very much for that. And now I'd like to invite Padmasuri to be interviewed.
Yes. Sounds a bit formal, doesn't it?
It does, yeah.
That was a great talk, by the way. I just thought, if I'd heard that when I was new to being, to hearing the Dharma, I'd been right in there. Yeah.
Yeah. So I won't introduce Padmasuri because I think you'll get to have a sense of her life just through the questions that I'm going to ask. But at a relatively young age, Padmasuri, I do know, went to India. Were you ordained at that point?
I was.
You
just, were? Yeah.
Okay.
It was, perhaps, should I say a bit about how I came to be?
Came to be, yeah, please do, yeah. How did you come to be in India?
Okay, so, well, I contacted Buddhism through Triratna, or the Friends of the Western Buddhist Order, as it was called back then, in 1976. I did get very involved very quickly, and I was ordained into our order in 1980, and in 1981, when I suppose must have just turned 30, I went out to India. And my trajectory before I came across Buddhism was that I would go and do VSO somewhere. Actually, I had Nepal in mind, and I trained as a nurse, and then I trained as a midwife, and that's exactly what I was going to be doing. I was going to go somewhere. But at the time when the somewhere came about, I was already quite deeply involved in Buddhism. And so I thought, right, I'll shelve that. I'd actually even been offered a job in Malawi in Africa. But I thought, well, maybe I'll do that a bit later. Got involved with Buddhism, met an order member who said, oh, Bhante Sangharakshita, the founder of our order and movement, had been talking about the need to do some Dharma work in India. And alongside the Dharma work, it would be really good to have some social projects. And my ears immediately pricked up.
Yeah.
And that's how eventually I came to go to India.
Great. So would you like to say a bit more about what you did when you got there? What did you actually do? How did it work out?
Okay, so there's an English doctor who's also in our order, Veerabhadra, and I'd been put in touch with him, and the idea was that he and I would go out to Pune, which is in Western India, in Maharashtra, and we would set up a medical project there amongst what were then called the sort of new Buddhists, people who converted under Dr Ambedkar, working in the slum areas, doing very basic, mainly mother and child health care. And so we were going out there, and so literally arrived in India. And, we had no real blueprint for what we were going to do, arrive and see what happened. And things happened.
Great. Yeah. So that for you, I mean, not dissimilar from Stephen, but that interest, that concern, social concern, kind of runs quite far back in your life.
It does. I mean, definitely pre-Buddhist. It goes back to, well, I mean, who knows where it began, but I can certainly remember, at the age of about 11, I had a school teacher who had been a missionary in Africa somewhere, and I remember her showing slides of, presumably doing missionary work there. I don't really know what it was. And I just had this strong, deep, quite impulse that I wanted to work in foreign lands and in developing countries. I can't say where it came from.
Yeah. And so when you found yourself there in India, you were doing both Dharma work and social work, which you were very attracted.
Yeah, well, you see, I imagined, naively, or whatever, I really only thought I'd only just been ordained, and I just assumed that I'd be mainly doing the medical work, which actually also burgeoned out. I mean, we did set up this medical project in slum areas, and then we were set up kindergarten schools. We were working with the local women, training them to train other people, and all that, and hostels were started. So all that was going on. But obviously I was a Buddhist, and I was there because our movement was also very strong in India. And there were retreats, just as we have retreats here, retreats were held there. And the very first retreat I went on, which was led by an English order member who's actually still lives out in India, Lokamitra. And I went on this retreat, and unlike here where people book and you're lucky if you get 20 people or something, there's 100 people came on this retreat, and 95 of them were men and 5 of them were women. And immediately some of the men order members were saying, well, Padmasuri, if you were to do something specifically for the women, they would come. We'd let them come. You know, Indian society was very, the women can be sort of quite subservient to the men. But, you know, if their husbands, their brothers, their fathers saw that a woman was leading something which they themselves had benefited from, then they would send their women folk to go on retreats. So I found myself actually doing lots of Dharma teaching, which I had never imagined back in England before I went there.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Unplanned.
Yeah.
So what was that like? Did you feel you know, like you were a frustrated social worker having to do Dharma? Did you feel like your Dharma work was sort of related, or
I felt it was completely related,
right,
actually.
Right.
And it is interesting how in India, you'll find, I'm sure Sanganath, I wasn't here at the weekend, but I'm sure Sanganath would have said this, but social work and Dharma work, sort of, let's say specifically Buddhist work, are totally inseparable. Here, we tend to separate them out. You know, you're Buddhist, you might do social work, in inverted commas social work, but there it's completely inseparable. And I think that's what, you know, that quote you had, I can't remember what you just said about Bhante and Ambedkar. And because obviously the situation of these former untouchables converting to Buddhism, this mass conversion, which carried on over decades, you know, was absolutely enormous for those people having self-confidence. And a lot of the work I was doing with women, yes, I would have, you know, a day retreat or maybe 2 or 3 days retreat when we had a retreat centre. And people would come away from their homes and they would light up. You know, a lot of these people would live in what you might call shanty towns. So they'd live in corrugated huts and one whole family in a room, kind of not much bigger than just where these chairs are, and they'd cook there and they'd sleep there and they'd live there. And then they'd come away on retreat and they'd experience a great freedom, and they'd also talk to each other. And the fact that I had done a certain amount of the social work before I started doing more overt Dharma work was actually really helpful, because I really got to understand how people lived and what their needs are. And you couldn't talk conceptual Dharma to them. You know, these were people, this was back in the 1980s, a lot of the women had never had the chance of any formal education. So, you know, a lot of my Dharma teaching would be, I learned how to do it, would be through storytelling. And, you know, you might say, well, you know how you take the stones out of the rice and you sift this and that, and you might talk about that as how you work on your mind and your mental states, and, you know, giving examples which they can relate to. And then they go home and then they will tell all their family about what they've learned. So, you know, it was a huge learning curve for me. No, I never felt frustrated because I felt they did come together.
Right, yeah, so they're complementary.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Yeah. So I guess I'm kind of interested in what sort of impact did that have on you? You'd encountered Buddhism in the West.
Yeah.
Very, very different circumstances, interest in social work, but there you were in India encountering a Buddhism that looked quite different in terms of, you know, you're saying social work and Buddhism were sort of, there wasn't this separation that was seen as the same thing. So how did that affect your own practice, your own understanding of what the Buddhist life is, and or your own Buddhist life?
That's a bit hard to say, but on the whole, I found it very refreshing. And I did have, you know, 1 or 2 visitors, I'm just thinking this now, you know, 1 or 2 visitors from the West, from England, who came and visited me when I was out there. And they seemed terribly self-concerned about their own, what was going on with their mind and their mental states and their own psychology, which actually is obviously just how I'd been before. And that isn't how Indians function. So we have a much more psychological take on things. They have a much more social take on things in India. And I think we could both do with a bit of the other. It's not as though one is better than the other, but they're just different. And I found it refreshing, and you could just see, you know, I mean, everywhere you go in India, I'm sure some of you have travelled in India, but everywhere you go, you see suffering is right there in front of you. And I mean, it's real hard suffering. It's, people, it's poverty, it's starvation. It's people sort of sleeping without any home, any roof over their heads. Of course, I mean, we do get that here in the West, but I mean, it's very small in comparison to there. Certainly the drive that you used to do, I don't know, they still do it from Bombay, what's now Mumbai Airport, into the centre of Mumbai. You were just passing all these shanty towns and people, in the mud and in the sewers and just like that. And I remember that first journey and thinking, I don't know that I can work here. I couldn't live like that. And I kept thinking, do I have to live like that? Well, no, I don't. And I couldn't, because I could never be like that. I couldn't just be an Indian the way they are. I think it just opened my mind to, sort of going back to your question, I think what working and living in India did, and I was there over a period of about 8 years, was give me a great sense of the Dharma is for everybody, and everybody can practice in whatever their conditions. I mean, conditions, and we talk in the West a lot about how important our conditions are, and I think they are. But, we talk about the importance. I'm sure those of you who've just been doing a Dharma course, probably talk very much about, find a nice quiet space where you can meditate. You can't say that to India. There is nowhere quiet. And a lot of the women, obviously I know much more about the women, the women would be up at 3 o'clock in the morning, because at 4 o'clock in the morning they'd need to start cooking the tiffin for the family to go to school or work or whatever. So it's just different, and yet they were practicing the Dharma, they were practicing the same Buddhism. So I suppose it gave me a less pressured, I think we can be a little bit pressured sometimes about our practice, me and my practice. And out there, it's all sort of out there in the open. Yes, and it is very sort of social there. So, if one family member, particularly if one of the male family members, happens to stumble across Buddhism, practicing Buddhism, goes on a retreat, has a really positive experience, he'll want to go home and encourage all his family and his neighbourhood to do likewise, whereas we might be very tentative to even tell our friends who aren't Buddhists that I've gone to the Cambridge Buddhist Centre. It certainly used to be in the 1980s, maybe not now. Buddhism is a household word, but then it wasn't so much.
And your experience of that cultural difference, that difference in Buddhism, it sounds like it was quite seamless. I mean, you said you had friends come and you were sort of a bit surprised.
Yes.
Or was it more disruptive than that for you, the transition?
No, I remember the first time I came back for a visit before I'd had gone there, I was living in East London around the London Buddhist Centre, Bethnal Green. And I remember the first visit coming back from India. When I went to India, I almost knew that I'd feel some culture shock, although I had actually been to India before I was a Buddhist, just travelled through. And I was a culture shock, but I was expecting that. I was not expecting a culture shock when I came back to my own country, where I was born and bred and brought up. And yet I looked and, frankly, people driving through the city of London in the early morning, somebody picked me up from Heathrow and driving me to Bethnal Green. And people looked strange, and they were wearing all this strange garb, the clothes. And at that time, women with all these sort of big hairdos were the thing, big hairdos, and sort of tight-fitting suits. And I was used to people, wearing these beautiful coloured saris and just being out and open and friendly and all chatting to each other. And here everyone was in their own world of it. I did find that quite tough to come to terms with, and I think I wasn't always very good at. I do remember going on a retreat back in England with some friends, and I could be a bit critical of how we were in the West. I had to be a bit careful of that as well, because it wasn't really that one was better than the other. It was just very, very different, and a certain integration had to continue.
Interesting. So can I ask you a bit more about when you came back? So when you came back, you were qualified as a nurse, weren't you? But you didn't work as a nurse. You came back in. How did you? What did you
when
do?
I came back to England.
Yeah, when you came back to England.
So
yeah.
after about 8 years, I mean, because of visa restrictions that were brought in at the time after Mrs. Gandhi's assassination, all that happened when I was in India. And then after about 8 years, I decided that I needed for myself actually to come back to England and almost rediscover my Buddhist roots in the West where I'd first discovered them. And I, again, it wasn't as though I had some master plan of, well, would I come? Maybe I really don't know. Maybe I was thinking, well, I'd come back for a couple of years, 2 or 3 years or something like that, and then maybe I'd go back to India. But, well, life takes its own directions, and, I did come back, and after a bit I moved to Cambridge because I got friends here, my partner was living here. And then I got involved in various livelihoods and lived in communities with other people. And, then my life really was much more in the West, I think, from then onwards. But India is I have been back for visits. And in fact, 2 years ago, I went back to India working with another Western woman, board member, Karuna Maya, who's been working in India for about 20 years. And together we did a 1-month retreat for young Indian women. And that was very fascinating because India has really dramatically changed since I was there, dramatically changed. And these young women were more like Western women, the kind of questions they'd have if I was on a retreat or if you were having some discussion group. They'd ask quite well thought through questions. They'd even have bits of cynicism in them. I thought, oh dear, that's some of the not such good sides of Western culture. They didn't take everything at face value, whereas on the whole, when I was there, you could say I had a captive audience. I mean, people were just crying out to hear the Dharma, and they were such strong faith followers of Dr Ambedkar, who they saw really as the Buddha. And, so it was through him that I was able to teach. And they were very, very, very genuine and sincere in that. But I wasn't challenged in a particular way. With these young women, they were much more challenging. Well, I don't know about this, and, what do you think about that? And it was good. It was different, and it was good. In a way, it's possibly intellectually a bit more stimulating, although I had other ways of getting that when I lived there.
So what about the sort of social aspect when you came back? That was very alive and very integrated in India. When you came, was that something you missed? Was that something you felt you were expressing in a different way? What?
It's interesting asking that question, because I think had I not found Buddhism, as I say, my whole trajectory was to do VSO, and I might have done some of the similar sort of things that you had done. And I think that probably would have been satisfying for possibly many years. But I'd also got Buddhism, I got the Dharma. And in the West, I could just see other things were needed. And and actually I think a lot of it was working with teams of people, particularly here in the West, actually working with teams of women in all sorts of situations. Some of you will know about Windhorse Evolution and the shops, and I worked there. I was Mitra convener here in Cambridge when I moved here. So my life was very, very full. So it wasn't as though I missed doing social work. And I think there's plenty of people who do social work. And there's something I've really had to think about. I'll just tell you a little story about. I was very fortunate to meet Dado Rinpoche, who was one of Sangharakshita's Tibetan teachers when Sangharakshita lived in India. And I saw him a couple of years before he died and went to visit him in Kalimpong. And it was when I was still working in India, and I was telling him a bit about our work and our social work and the more overtly Buddhist teaching work, you could say. And he said, well, it's very good you're doing all the social work, but there's many, many social workers in the world, but there's very few really sincerely practicing Buddhists. If you can bring those two together, then that's absolutely brilliant. But I felt in the West, and particularly in the era when I got involved with our movement in the mid-70s and through for many of the 80s, we were just building this new Buddhist movement, this new Buddhist Sangha, which now is very international and huge. But then a lot of us who were around in those early days, as we often say, we threw in our lot with this new Buddhist movement because we were trying to create something that was quite new and was quite revolutionary. Now, people come along and, some people just have a taster of Buddhism and come and learn meditation, that's all they want. Other people get quite deeply involved. And, you could choose a lifestyle and it will affect, every lifestyle affects everybody else. But you could do your particular, have your particular lifestyle and your particular interests, and that would all positively infect our Buddhist movement, but it wouldn't necessarily be having to teach at a Buddhist centre or go and live in a retreat centre or doing the more sort of central activities of Triratna.
Yeah. So you feel that the needs are different now. There are opportunities now, and the possibilities of ways of engaging are.
I think they are. Yeah. I think they are, and I think our society is changing. And the pandemic's changed it yet again. But I mean, our society is changing. What you were talking about, the environment and things. Those things were hardly in my consciousness 40 years ago when I was first a Buddhist. So I think all these things being brought in, yes, I think people can be very, very creative. But I think there's something different. If you're just doing, people have a sort of mission about a particular thing, and if it's in the environment, and, maybe people are quite, some Buddhists are activists as well, and I think that's great. But I think you can be a better activist, probably, if there's a few of you who've really got the same dharmic values together, and you're doing whatever your activity is, than if you're just one single person sort of crying out on your own. So, I hope people will get together, but also making sure that the social action, whatever it might be, doesn't get sidelined off to being an end in itself, because somehow the Dharma has to fuel whatever that action is, as I see it.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting.
The wisdom, the compassion, those qualities you were talking about, Ambedkar. Yeah.
So what would that look like, that social action becoming an end in itself?
I don't know. Perhaps I could throw that out to other people. I don't think I could answer that simply. Well, I suppose, ensuring that one keeps, ethics, our own ethic, our own ethical values, very much at the core. We don't just want to be running social projects, but we do need to be aware of the society around us. I mean, actually, even in really little ways. I mean, I'm not talking about grandiose things. My partner was actually just telling me years ago that around the London Buddhist Centre there had been a very snowy winter and all the roads had got blocked off, and the London Buddhist Centre was up and running. That was our really big centre then. And one person said, it was a real shame when we had that snowfall that nobody went out and cleared the streets and helped the other shopkeepers around or did that. We have been possibly a bit insular and a bit sort of in our own world. And I think that was, some of that maybe was necessary to really get the movement off the ground. But I also think we must be aware of the society around us. And it's really, I landed in India. I went there to do the medical work, but I ended up doing, other social projects and the Dharma teaching, which I had never sort of imagined doing. So I suppose it's always being aware to, what is around, what's on my doorstep now, what could I do to make other people's lives maybe, and my own life a bit better, a bit more compassionate, a bit more aware of other people, a bit more in harmony with the way things really are.
Yeah, great. That very much links in with Stephen's lovely evocation of how he ended up getting more out of out of giving. I just perhaps a last thing to ask you. You when we were talking earlier, you mentioned this distinction between social and altruism. I just wondered if you'd like to say a bit about what you mean by that and what's the significance of it.
So when we talk about India, I think we do very much talk about social work and Dharma work kind of can't really be separated out. But even though we in the West may not ourselves be involved in overtly social projects, even that word, what do we mean by that? Running old people's homes or something like that, which would be a great thing to do. We might not be doing that, but at the same time we can have an altruistic, other-regarding attitude which actually infects other people. And a great quote of Dr Ambedkar's is, you can't change society without changing your mind. We need to work on ourselves, and that will have an effect on society. So it's self and other, and Buddhism very much teaches self and other, and I think that's what our movement is founded on. In a way, Sangha actually very much had it was self and other. And sometimes the emphasis maybe needs to be more on our own practice and our meditation and our Dharma study, and being a little bit sort of cut off from, not exactly cut off, but a bit more isolated. But then it's like when you go on retreat, it's a bit like that. But we go on retreat to come back into the world. It's the influence. Actually, it's the way you were teaching the Metta Bhavana a bit earlier this evening, I felt. We don't just meditate now to have a good meditation. We meditate because it affects, what we do over the next hours and days and weeks. Great.
Yeah. Thank you very, very much, Padmasuri.
Okay.
I wonder if just in the last 5-6 minutes I could invite Stephen up and we could just see if there's any questions that people would like to ask either Padmasuri or Stephen.
Feel free.
Stephen, can I ask you something?
Yeah.
Your friend, your Ugandan Theravada teacher.
Yeah.
Where did he come across? How did he come across Buddhism? How did he come across?
Right. Good question. He first encountered Buddhism when he was a student in India. Quite a lot of Ugandans do travel overseas to get education, and he was studying, I think, economics or something in India, and had some friends who were Buddhists, and that sort of piqued his interest. And then he sort of embarked on a very long journey of exploration, other traditions as well as Buddhism. But he eventually ended up, he met the Dalai Lama a few times, he looked into Mahayana Buddhism as well, but he ended up with the Theravadins, and he trained for ordination in a monastery in the US, actually, so, yeah. And then his abbot said to him, I think you should go back to Uganda, take the Dharma to Uganda. Yeah.
Very good.
There's a question from Virajoti to Stephen, just asking, what draws you back to Uganda time and time again?
I think it's the people, really, fundamentally. I mean, it is a beautiful country, and it's always, for me, a joy to go there, but it's also quite a difficult place in lots of ways. I mean, Kampala, the capital, is just chaos now, probably almost like an Indian city. not always a very enjoyable experience, to be honest. But once you get out in the countryside, fantastic. And but really, it's the people. Actually, I've always just found such warmth and acceptance. Never felt any sense of resentment about the colonial history or any of that stuff. Which I thought would be quite likely actually, but it never experienced that. So just very warm and generous. Yeah, it's very good friendships.
I've got one. It could be for either of you. But when you talk about Buddhism changing society, and I think you talked about not just pure social work, could you imagine that it might affect values in business at all?
That might affect
Values in business, the way people conduct business and governance of business, and changing that way.
I would think so. I would hope so. And in fact, we've had a lot of experiments within our Buddhist movement. Katie Rogers saw very much. Don't you work in the?
I work with Katie Rogers. New View,
yeah. But there was one big business, Windhorse Evolution, which closed down about 6 years ago, was it? Yeah, 6 years ago. But that was a real experiment of Buddhists working together in it was a gift business, and it had a whole lot of shops, outlets, but it was Buddhists working together, making money, but also having an interface with the world. But we very much would discuss in small meetings, in bigger meetings, how we ran the business, along ethical lines, but the ethics was not just sort of fair trade, obviously that kind of thing, but it was also our own ethics, how we work and how we work together. So yes, I think it could, and I think Buddhism. I mean, we've got people. Obviously, mindfulness has become a really big thing now. And I can think of one person who lives here in Cambridge, Kulananda, who does a lot of mindfulness teaching in corporate businesses and things like that. So it goes out, and although he's going, I mean, I don't even know whether a lot of them would know he was a Buddhist, but I mean, he must take his Buddhist values in there, even though he's teaching more mindfulness. So, yeah.
I've got one question for you, Padmasuri.
Yeah.
I was interested about how you taught. You said a little bit about how you found a way of teaching the Dharma to women who had very little education, whose conceptual framework was not what you've been used to with people in the West. Could you say a little bit more about how you found ways to really communicate some important truths about the Dharma to those women?
Yeah, well, as I say, so a lot of it was storytelling. And, say I was giving, because I used to, occasionally I was asked to give these big public talks where, there may be 500, 1,000 people even in, some village or something like that. And it would all be set up and organised. And I might give the 5 precepts, the 5 Buddhist precepts that we take. It might be a talk on that. So I would give lots of stories, an example of, the first precept, with deeds of loving kindness, I purify my body. So I'd talk about how people can, do deeds of loving kindness. And I give examples from their lives. You're going to ask me a specific example. I think it was using imagery that they could relate to, story. I mean, Bhante did this himself when he was in India. If you ever hear any of his talks, which, a lot of them were recorded, a lot of them were written down, he'd tell stories about sheep or about tigers or about frogs or whatever, and he'd never talk like that kind of for us in the West. But he'd give those stories because those were the things they'd remember. And then would they remember some sort of specific dharmic point because of the story? So they may remember the story, and then sometimes they'd think, so what was the actual point of that? But you could go back then and work out what the dharmic principle was. But an actual example now I'd have to think. But I gave that example, didn't I, of the rice. So anyone who's been, to any country where you see them sifting the rice, taking out the stones so that they can cook it, So that every single woman would know exactly what you mean about doing that with the rice. And then you might talk about, say, your mind, and then you have these mental states which are not very helpful, and you feel a bit angry or feel a bit that, and, you know, you could pick around and find, well, where is that? And, you know, you don't have to keep that in the rice, and you can throw it out, or whatever it might be. Simple, almost simplistic, but they would laugh and they get the jokes, and they'd joking, actually, joking as in storytelling, light-hearted storytelling. They would love, and even that sometimes I would say give some of the same stories again and again, and they would remember them, and they'd come back, and you know, you're waiting for the punch line, and I'd say it, and they'd roar with laughter. And I think, oh my God, you know, if this was on, you know, TV or something, you'd be thrown out immediately in the West. But yes, finding pertinent things from their lives. Yeah.
What language were you teaching in?
Well, you know, I tried to learn the local language of Marathi, which they speak in Maharashtra, and I learnt enough to just get by, but teaching, I always would have a translator. So I had, you know, I was very fortunate. There were a couple of women when I lived in India who both spoke, well, they were English medium educated, because a lot of people are. That was sort of the good education, I suppose, with the English medium. So they would translate for me, and they were both exceptionally good. Yeah, and just really good friends. Yeah, the whole thing of friendship. Yeah, that's the biggest thing. Yeah.
I think that is, we're coming just towards the end of the evening. So a last big thank you to Stephen and Padmasuri. Great. And yeah, just before we all head off, so we've got 3 more weeks actually in this theme. Next week, Kulapriya is going to be giving us a talk on one of the, I think it's one of the seminal papers, isn't it, of Ambedkar. So looking at a bit more directly at a seminal paper that Dr Ambedkar gave to Indian society. What's the title? The Buddha and the Future of His Religion.
Oh.
Yeah. A really sort of exciting, really, really radical paper. So he's going to be talking about that next week. So come along and join in the exploration. It's something I wasn't expecting actually, but I thought both Stephen and Padmasuri evoked the adventure actually of when you don't just decide what you're going to do, you're actually sort of responsive to what is needed. And that's taken sort of both of them in different directions from what they'd imagined. And there's something quite attractive about it, isn't there? It's kind of, I'd quite like to do that. So, yeah, I just wanted to say that. And then lastly, all the meditation and Buddhism that we teach, we share here at the centre is freely given. Actually, this whole building has been given. Padmasuri was part of the team, I would think, who sort of raised funds in order to buy this building. So really kind of what we're involved in here is all sort of freely given. This whole sort of situation is freely given. If you want to sort of experiment with being part of that, then you can give. You can give in all sorts of ways. One way you can give is financially. So that is just an open invitation. We are very happy to freely give what we give, freely share it. We've benefited tremendously. But the invitation there to join in that is an open invitation. So there are Dharma, we use the word Dharma, which is a Buddhist word for generosity, boxes there's a red one on the door as you go out. A lot of people give standing orders actually. If you feel like you'd like to do that, then on the website you can easily do that. But, well, can someone, in case, man the card machine. Do we have anyone who can run the card machine? Great, thank you. Just in case anyone wants to give by card. It's an open invitation if you'd like to join in more deeply. That's one way of doing it. Great, so thanks all for coming. Thanks to online. We can give away to people online. And see you all again next week.